I know parking is a little tiny bit of a challenge. Rainy days bring out everybody, so good. We're good. All right. Well, as most of you know, I'm Denise Murray Edwards. I'm the fortunate president of the Harvard Club of Cape Cod, and it's so exciting to see you back here in this room. And we sort of moved from Afghanistan last time to a historical perspective and a global approach. And as you know, the entrance and the exit are in the same place. I welcome the people that are online, and I wish well those of you online who had to switch out of our lunch group because you're ill, and I hope you're better soon, and I thank you for not sharing what your fellow passengers shared with you when you were in transit. One of the things that we're going to be doing at lunch, because we've been really excited about doing discussions, because after the Afghanistan talk with Jill, people said, we really wish we had an opportunity to talk more about the situation in Afghanistan and her experience. So this time, at Dr. Norris's recommendation, we're going to have a really wonderful discussion group over at Alberto's, and they have worked with us to give us a lovely short lunch, and the focus will be on talking. And Dr. Norris has also put together a paper for discussion. And for those of you that are online, we will send that to you. And so you will be virtual participants, although not today in the discussion, and we would welcome any feedback that you have. And we will incorporate that into a document that we will be preparing and sending back to Harvard. So please get back to us at the Harvard Club site. And with no more to be said, Roger Landry, our wonderful Vice President for Events, is going to come up and introduce our speaker for today.
Okay, thank you, Denise. I am Roger Landry, and on behalf of the Harvard Club of Cape Cod, you want me over here? Oh, I can't pace. Oh boy, now I'm handicapped. On behalf of the Harvard Club of Cape Cod, we welcome you here, both those of you who are here and those of you who are virtual. Here I am. And we deeply appreciate you taking this time. We know that this is a particularly topical subject that we're going to approach. Well, first of all, there will be the opportunity for questions after the presentation, and virtually at the bottom of your screen at the chat function, you can put in questions, and I will deliver them to our speaker. So I think as an audience, we have Harvard Club members and guests. We have other club members and guests. We have JFK members. And once again, even though Wendy isn't here, I want to thank her as the director of this museum for hosting us once again. This is a magnificent place to have, and sometimes a very appropriate place to have some of the topics that we talk about. So I think we're bonded by, this audience, by a shared positive experience of an academic time in our lives. And I believe that most of us also believe that there's an existential threat to some of the things we hold dear about those experiences. Now, our speaker, our own, and I say our own Pippa Norris because she is not only a Harvard professor, she is a member of the Harvard Club of Cape Cod. Last January, you gave us a very informative, if not very disturbing, talk on the rise of authoritarian populism in the world. And that was extremely well received. So given what's been happening on the campuses, not only Harvard, but other campuses, when Pippa came forward and said, I wrote a paper by this title here, do you think people would like to hear about that? We thought it was a rhetorical question, really, or a trick question. And so we knew it had to happen, and it is going to happen. Dr. Pippa Norris is the Paul McGuire lecturer for the Kennedy at the Kennedy School on comparative politics. That puts her in a perfect place. She is a VP of the World Values Survey, and she is also the founding director of the Election Integrity Project. All things I think that are very much related to what's going on today. So I would like you to give her a very warm welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So it's really a pleasure to be back and to see all my colleagues and friends from my last talk. And today, obviously, we're all very concerned with the developments. I was just looking on my phone to see what else has happened since I left and before I got here in terms of universities and how things are changing. And I'd like us to think about this in two different ways. One is really, what can we do as a community? What can we do as an association to try to strengthen academic freedom, whether it's at Harvard or any other universities and colleges which are under threat? And so that's really the point of what we're trying to do, and particularly in the discussion. It's practical actions that you might think could really help, that again, the board could perhaps channel and bring back to either Harvard or other places. It may be that, for example, writing to Congress and your representative, or joining up with other groups, or a variety of other activities that you think work could be incorporated. But also, I think we need to think hard, what is academic freedom? Why is this such a contentious issue? And so this paper is part of my research on this topic. I've published a couple of articles which are related to this. And the title is First They Came for the Scholars. I'll explain that in a minute. And it's really saying that there are two different ways that we can think about the threats. One is external, i.e. the state regulating universities, and particularly in the private sector, what would be the appropriate boundaries there? And then the other one is internal threats, which arise from the culture on campus. And is there actually viewpoint diversity? Or do some groups, minorities, those who are more heterodox, feel that their views are not being represented effectively in student bodies or in the faculty or in the curriculum or wherever? And both of these, I think, are threats. And we often think about the external threats right now because that's often in the headlines. But in fact, there's a reason why it's so much of a hot button issue. This is where the title came from. And it's Pastor Niemöller, 1946, immediately after the Nazis. And it's a famous poem that I'm sure you'll all have come across. And it's just so powerful. And it doesn't refer to scholars, but nevertheless, the idea is that we are under attack in terms of so many of the things that we value. And as the poem says, first they came for the communists, but I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. And then the trade unions, and then the Jews. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me. So it was 1946, after the defeat of Hitler and the Nazis, and a Lutheran priest who said, well, we just did not do what we should have done to stop the authoritarian forces which ended up with World War II. And so everybody essentially should be able to do something. And by the way, if you're feeling anxious, if you're feeling worried, the best thing you can do is to find some action collectively where you feel your part. It's not just me, it's not just you, it's everybody can do something together to really push back in effective ways, in deliberate ways, to really press against some of the changes going on in America right now. So what am I going to do? This is the structure of the talk. Talk about the context briefly. You cannot pick up a New York Times, a Washington Post, or anything else, PBS, NPR, without finding something about what's going on. I'll just briefly summarize what that is. I'll talk about the concept of academic freedom. What does it mean? And the values. Why is it important? And then I'll give us some evidence. And here I'm going to be a bit more dispassionate, a bit less personal, and talk about the external constraints by looking around the world at where academic freedom has flourished and where it's declined in the 21st century, from 2000 to 2024. And we can see, therefore, America in a comparative perspective because I'm a comparativist. And then we'll look at internal constraints, which are much more difficult and much more subtle and much more difficult to document. But I carried out a survey of the political science profession around the world. And we have 2,000 respondents. And I'll give a little bit about that, about who is basically self-censoring, who is not speaking up, who feels uncomfortable to say difficult things on campus. And this is amongst a group of political scientists who are scholars and faculty. And then the conclusions and what can we do? And the what can we do is really up to you. I'm not going to tell you what to do. I'm going to say, let's think about that as a group, and that's what we need to brainstorm about. So the key argument I'm going to develop is that academic freedom for years and years has been seen as a fundamental right. If you look at UNESCO, if you look at the UN General Assembly, if you look at any of the work, most people would argue that it's part of democracy. Academic freedom has two components. It's about protecting institutional autonomy or self-governance. Now, of course, as Iris mentioned, it's in fact shared governance, because the state will always have some role, whether it's funding students, for example, or whether it's setting certain standards in academic qualifications or a variety of other areas. But nevertheless, self-governance is the basic idea, that it should not be that there's any dictation on terms of who should be hired, who should be recruited, how we should conduct our research, which topics are appropriate, etc., etc. And it should be essentially one which is left, like any profession, to govern itself. And secondly, there should be individual scholarly independence. That even if I don't agree with any of my colleagues in a particular department or in a particular discipline or a particular subfield, I should be able to pursue my teaching and my research unconstrained by those sorts of political or ideological considerations. But there are two types of threats which are currently confronting the world and America and Harvard. And the two threats are both the external role of the state, and especially in autocracies, they've always been the most restrictive on academic freedom. If you try to speak independently in Russia or in Venezuela or in many other countries which have been most repressive, such as China, and you speak up as an independent scholar, or you try to, for example, have a strong university in Hungary, then those are being eaten away by the state. In many countries, it's part of backsliding. Why? Because if you have an independent set of intellectuals, that's obviously a challenge to all of those who are in power, and particularly the powerful executive. And the Academic Freedom Index is a good index. It's an annual index, and I'll talk about the evidence, and we can see that it's systematically declined and it's linked to democratic backsliding. The two things go hand in hand. So don't think this is just a university problem. This is about the suppression of independent voices in the society in general. And then there are internal threats, which I think are equally real and which many liberals don't necessarily recognize as strongly, but I think can also undermine the basic sense of what education, the best education, is about. And they come because of cultural processes, not because of the law. They come from within, not from without. And they essentially constrain what people feel comfortable talking about, what people feel should be on the book list, what people should be the things that we read, what people should be taught in classrooms, and what should be part of our discussion. And this is much more difficult to actually tackle because it's informal, it's the norms of how you work. But it's reinforced by the law and by state constraints as well. And so we've got to think hard about that. And then actions, what do we do? That's up to you. I'm not going to tell you what to do. You have to work that out. Now, the context. You know, obviously, that there's a long history here, but essentially the key catalyst at Harvard was the federal demands. People say that the letter that came from 3 officials in the federal government was an accident. It was sent off too early. Who knows what it was? But if you've read, there's a whole series of demands that were made of Harvard. On the 11th of April, I mentioned that because it was a Friday, and it was on Monday that Harvard came back and said, no, we are not going to do this. What were the demands? Governance reform in leadership, who should be essentially part of the deans and part of the provost and the president. Merit-based hiring and administration. Well, who could be against that, except that it really is very questionable what it means to have a merit-based and how that's defined, and is that ideological? But there should be no race, color, or national preferences, they argue. So it's not just affirmative action, which of course has disappeared at Harvard, but in terms of recruiting students, no race, color, or national preferences. International admissions are reformed to reject those hostile to US values. International students and their visas are one of the key areas which the State Department is thinking about, and Marco Rubio is talking about. If that goes, then of course, for example, the Kennedy School will lose half its students. Half are international, and I personally am going to lose something like 85% of my classes because I have mostly international students in my classrooms. And we're going to somehow vet them, or somebody's going to vet them. Harvard is going to vet them. The State Department is going to vet them. If they're hostile to quote unquote US values, what does that mean? I don't know, but that was part of the demands. Viewpoint diversity. So we get rid of DEI, but we bring back viewpoint diversity. What does that mean? It's going to be audited according to the demand in admissions and hiring for students. So we're going to find out what their political beliefs are. How did you vote in the last election, perhaps? I don't know. Faculty and staff. Well, good luck with that. I don't think you're going to be able to get any sort of effective implementation of that. Somebody comes up for a job offer and you're going to work out what their ideological beliefs and political beliefs are. Reform programs for anti-Semitism bias, yes. President Garber says, yes, that's part of what we need to do, but it should be from within. We have a commission. We've been setting up how we can respond to that. We should discontinue DEI, which of course is a common demand across many agencies. We should have stronger student discipline if they protest, and a quarterly report monitoring all of this, going back to the White House, going back to the federal government until 2028. Big Brother is going to be looking at us to see whether or not that happened. So it was so enormous, such a demand, that of course it was unacceptable. It could not have happened. It could not be accepted by any ethical standards by Harvard. And so this was the letter, and I'm sure all of you will have seen it. It's been republished and it's available. I always give the source, and I'm happy to for anybody to take the set of slides if they want to look further. The administrator's prescription goes beyond the power of the federal government, especially over a private sector institution. It violates our First Amendment rights in terms of what we could do and say, and exceeds the statutory limits of the government's authority under Title VI. And it threatens our values as a private institution devoted to the pursuit, production, and dissemination. And this one, which is being widely quoted, has really been very powerful. It was a beautifully crafted letter if you looked through the whole thing. But the claim which Alan Garber says is no government, regardless of party, should dictate what private universities can teach, whom they can admit and hire, and which areas of study and inquiry they can pursue. So it was a very strong rejection, and after the actions by Columbia, it was certainly seen as the first glimpse of a resistance amongst universities. But since then, what's been happening is, of course, that there are many universities, and it's not simply Harvard which is under threat. These are each of the different demands. So currently we're suing the administration. There's going to be a court action in July. That's when it's going to start. So we'll have to see how that develops. And there are threats to the tax-exempt status of all of those who are donating to Harvard, which would be a tremendous economic hit. And the most recent, which came yesterday, that our eligibility for new research grants, whether it's for cancer, whether it's for poverty, whether it's for any issue that we're researching on, we're now no longer eligible according to the Department of Education that's left. Brown University, Columbia, Cornell, Northwestern, Pennsylvania, Princeton have all been financially hit one way or another, sometimes substantially with $1 billion, sometimes less. And all of these things are work in progress. It's very difficult to actually document what's happening because things are announced and then they're pushed back, et cetera, et cetera. 60 colleges plus are being investigated for anti-Semitism, and they're all across the different bodies, different levels, not simply the Ivy League schools by any means. Now, what else has happened? The AAC and U, the Association of Academic Colleges and Universities, has come back collectively for the first time. A little slow, but now about almost 100 presidents of universities and colleges have signed the letter endorsing it, saying we need constructive engagement, which is a very nice phrase, not just a rejection, but constructive engagement to strengthen academic freedom. And we need to act collectively, not just individually. We can't just protect Princeton, we can't just protect Brown or Harvard. We have to think about this as a situation as a whole. So that's the context, and you've all been seeing it in the newspapers, I'm sure, and reading about it and so on. So how do we think about this issue? And when we talk about academic freedom, what do we mean by that? And what are the real challenges which we're facing? So let's think about this a little bit in terms of the actual concept. And this is one way to think about it. There are various definitions which are available, but this is from the UN. And I always go back to the UN for many statements of human rights and basic principles, because we know that covers the world. and they've gone through a variety of different perspectives, and it's the right to freedom of opinion and expression. And this is what they say, that individuals, as members of academic communities, and in their own pursuits, so in other words, when they're teaching, when they're studying, when they're writing, when they're publishing, in academic journals or in a public sphere like in social media, should be free to conduct activities involving the discovery and transmission of information and ideas, and to do so with the full protection of human rights law. That it's not just a nice thing, it's something which is part of a body of law. And all UN member states are therefore obliged, they have responsibilities, to protect individual scholars without undue political interference and guarantee these rights by safeguarding their autonomy and self-governance of the institution. So the two things go hand in hand. And so individual scholars should not be imprisoned for being dissidents in China or opposing the Ukrainian war in Russia, and nor should academic institutions like the European University be kicked out of a country like Hungary. There has to be a sense where there's freedom and rights. So why is this important? Well, here's a whole set of arguments. And this is a set of claims, and this is from UNESCO. Without academic freedom, societies lose an essential element of what we're about. And it's not just the universities and colleges which matter. If you don't have that, you don't have democracy, because how can people be educated? How can people know about different sources of information if the intellectuals are constrained? There's no capacity for self-reflection, meaning rational thought and deliberation and discussion, because you don't have those skills, cognitive skills, civic skills. Knowledge generation is limited, and also broad policy outputs, technological outputs, improvements in people's lives like healthcare are also stymied. And there's a long list of other values that you can argue are part of the output. So you can say academic freedom is important for itself, but it's also important because without it, how are you going to get all these other different types of things? We know the problems, for example, of informed citizenship in America. People believe in conspiracies. People don't know the facts. People believe their own side. They don't believe the other side. How can you find out about these things unless you have academic freedom in schools and in colleges and in universities? How can you have creative arts? How can you have science and the basic scientific breakthroughs that we all need? Because pure research is not going to be paid for by companies or industries. It has to be based on some sort of common good, which is going to have a common impact on technology years down the road. And even things like vocational skills. You obviously need to have law schools. You need to have public health schools. You need to have certification for every single degree. And for every country that's poor, you need to have education for human development. So academic freedom, put like that, is important, and we need to defend it. That's the rationale. That's what we're fighting for. Now, what does it actually mean? So here's the argument in the paper. We're always thinking about things like constraints which the government, the federal government or state government or local government is putting on the work of scholars and intellectuals and academics. And that's really important. You might have seen most recently, for example, in Texas, that the State House is about to really strengthen the way in which it changes the law to have direct control over many aspects of something like 129 universities, leading universities in Texas as a whole. And they're going to have a direct role, for example, in vetoing things like hiring and appointments in Texas universities. They're going to look at the curriculum, they're going to look at the books in the libraries, and a wide variety of other things. So restrictions can arise by outside institutions, and there are many who play a role. Elected politicians, of course, education boards, other associations of NGOs who are concerned about either defending or attacking academic freedom, and state laws and regulations, meaning nation states can be important. But there's also restrictions on what you can say within any university or within any classroom or what you can get published. And that's to do with the internal cultural. In other words, what are the values, what's the norms that guide what should be taught, that guide student discussion? And if I was to take the classic issue, for example, of the Gaza and Israel conflict right now, why was there such tension on campus? Why were students protesting? Why was it such a divisive issue even amongst faculty as well? And one could argue that that was about the internal culture, whether people are tolerant of the other side, whether people are willing to talk and deliberate, or whether they're going to protest and object to the other side, even having a hearing. In other words, cancel culture is part of those limits on viewpoint diversity. What you can say, what you can talk about, is it acceptable to the culture on campus? And my prediction is that legal restrictions can also exert an indirect effect on the culture through encouraging practices of academics and the values which are within the university to self-censor. Now let's look at the before I go on to look at some of the evidence, any thoughts about what I've said so far? Do you agree or disagree that these are some of the key challenges? Is this notion of academic freedom the one that you yourself would share? Or are there questions? I see Roger's nodding, which is always a good sign. Aris, the things I've said so far, are they things that resonate with you for academic freedom? Yes. That's to say, democracies, liberal democracies, and for more than a century, the philosophy of liberal education from John Stuart Mill and Dewey and so on very much reflects these core notions. You should be able to be critical, deliberative. You should be able to have all different viewpoints on campus and learn the other side as much as your own side. That's the kind of core idea of diversity. Anybody else want to push back on what I've said so far? Anybody, please. Oh, well, you can agree as well. That's good.
The retired New York City educator.
Yep.
I'm listening to this. I have children on Facebook who will tell me, I'm so glad that you taught us about Ruby Bridges in the classroom, because it was something that came out that said that can't be taught anymore.
Yeah,
so
that's
in my
right.
Class teaching Norman Rockwell, it was important to teach the problem we all live in, and so I always connect the art to the history.
Absolutely.
And so, by the way, I really thank the Kennedy Museum. This is my art and poetry.
Yeah.
So it's something. So I'm really excited that Wendy wants to do it, but it's stuck. You know, there are people. As I do this work, I'm feeling like I'm going to be held back.
Yes.
I'm going to be stopped. There's going to be,
that's right.
Friction.
You're not able to say things.
I'm not able. I mean, I'm retired. I can do, but it depends on what's going on in the environment.
Right. And you've seen what's happening in the Smithsonian, and the historians are coming out as a collective to say you can't rewrite history, and suddenly, it's a certain history of America which is not necessarily America because it's leaving out. Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's right. No. I think there are so many other aspects of the arts and related communities. It's not simply the colleges and universities, but they're part of it as well. But what's happening at the Smithsonian is going to be disastrous in so many ways. Blue.
Just a quick one on the internal self-censorship.
Yes.
What was, there's an organization called FIRE that I
There
don't know
is.
what it stands for, and I know they rated Harvard badly.
Absolutely. We came right at the bottom. There were 3 colleges right at the bottom. So there are a lot of, there's also PEN. PEN is about the freedom for writers and freedom of expression. And then there's Article 19. There's a lot of in the field of NGOs who are focused on these issues of free speech and free expression. And I think that's a critical part of what we're talking about, but it is only one part. But freedom of expression for Harvard, you have to look at their methodology. You can look at them, fire.org. There's also groups like the Heterodox Academy. You might have heard of those, who've come up again most recently and talked about how do we get diversity of minority views in a variety of different ways, conservative views, socially conservative, religious views, etc., etc. So there are lots of organizations out there really getting fired up by this debate. And the fact that Harvard does so badly is always being used against to substantiate the critique that there's a lot of anti-Semitism at Harvard, which the evidence is kind of either way in a number of things. But yes, we need to look at those indices and how they're constructed, and we need to say, how would you start to measure these sorts of things across different states? There is at present, for example, no statewide comparison of all of these legislative changes in academic freedom and in schools, as well as in colleges and universities. And I think that's an important thing that somebody needs to do. And we need to monitor where things are in terms of the changes which are going on in academic cultures. Well, look, let's look at some evidence, and I'll first give you the external and then the internal. External is easier to understand. This is from, you may remember, maybe you don't, in January I talked about the Variety of Democracy Project, great organization based at the University of Gothenburg, and they developed something called the Academic Freedom Index, which they produce every year for every country worldwide, 179 countries, and it measures this, our rights without constriction of prescribed doctrine, of freedom of teaching, freedom to carry out research, dissemination and publishing, and to express our opinion, or in the system, free of institutional censorship, and to participate in academic bodies. So what we can do is we can look at the picture worldwide, and we can look at it in terms of change by simply looking at the net index in 2000, turn of the 21st century, 2023, i.e. prior to the Trump administration. All of these come out a year after there actually was measuring it. So 1 year from now in March, we'll get the current estimate. But let's look at what was happening beforehand. Firstly, what's the relationship between democracy today in 2023 and academic freedom? And this is the pattern. And as you can see, there's really rather a nice relationship. This is their academic freedom index in 2023, highest over here, lowest, of course, in places like Iran, Turkey, and Egypt. And this is the liberal democracy index from low to high. And what you can see is that there's a very familiar pattern. The colors, by the way, are by the type of regime. Green are liberal democracies. I very much anticipate that America, which is right now green in 2023 under Biden, is probably going to change to the next level down, which is essentially electoral democracies. These are the yellow ones. These are traffic lights colors, right? Electoral democracies are places like Brazil, Colombia, Greece, interestingly, Poland, and so on. We'll have to see. I'm not sure, because Germany is so high and has such a strong democracy score that in a sense it's a bit like when you're grading students. It's different between a B+ and a B- is when you kind of move a category. And I can think that they do have problems with the AFD, but I'm not sure that they're going to go immediately sliding a lot in where they are. They still have a very robust democracy in my view, and their history means that they feel entitled to limit the AFD's role. So what's at the top in terms of the liberal democracies? Well, of course, it's some of the most affluent. And every time I do any survey and every time I do any graph, who's at the top? The Scandinavians, I'm afraid. It's always Sweden and Norway. I don't even need to look at the numbers. And the affluent countries like Germany and France, etc. But we can also see, for example, Chile is doing quite well, Lithuania is doing quite well, Seychelles, a very small country, is doing quite well, South Korea is relatively well, and so on, in both academic freedom and in democracy. And the United States is over here. And Japan is over there as well. And what that says is that in academic freedom, despite the fact that in our assumptions, we assume that the US might have led on that, not so. And obviously one can deconstruct the meaning of this, but nevertheless, on this particular area, still strong-ish on democracy, although it has come down, but not so good on academic freedom. Look at the comparisons of some of those countries on that level of dimension. So part of that is the first Trump administration, but part of that is other things which have been going on perhaps in academic life in America. And we can see that as we go down, we get a whole bunch of mixed countries, some of which are fairly strong, interestingly, on academic freedom. Nigeria, for example, I wouldn't have expected to be there. Bosnia, Herzegovina, Zambia, Mongolia. And then right down here, we have the worst countries in terms of both democracy and in terms of academic freedom. And so these are the obvious countries like Thailand, who's had a military coup, and Egypt with a general who's changed his spots, but he's still very restrictive. Russia, of course, Vietnam, a one-party state, Sudan with its civil war, Turkey with real problems after the 2016 attempt at Erdogan, where he really persecuted academics because they're public servants. Iran, and we know the problems particularly for women there. That's China as the blob there. They're all done by the size of the blobs of the population sizes. Okay, so democratic levels of democracy is related to academic freedom and changes are also predicted on this basis. Here we're not looking at the absolute. What we're looking at is the change over 20 years in wrongly spelt academic freedom, as Carrick come doing, I can't even spell, or typo anyway. These are the ones that have gained. So there are some gains in the world, and these are the ones which have lost over these 20 years. And we can see, therefore, that you might have expected again that there would be a modest loss, perhaps, but the United States has really been doing pretty badly, and it's that green blob behind this blob, which is China, which is interesting. And so again, we can see certain developments. So this, for example, again, is if you, this is Orban, Viktor Orban, kicking back on the European University, which Michael Ignatieff was the president of, where they had to move, block and move their campus and so on. This is Modi in India. And again, a country which has had democracy for decades now since independence, and yet has had real problems for the Muslim minority and for other issues of free speech, being critical of the government. Nicaragua, that's the problems which have been going on with Daniel Ortega, who has increasingly become repressive. He used to be liberal, and then over the years, he's just consolidated his position. Russia, we know about. Bangladesh has had problems. Venezuela, of course, under Hugo Chavez, and then Maduro, etc. So I do think that the countries here do reflect my own sense of what's going on in the world. And it does appear that America is really doing badly. And this is before 2025. Right? Oh, up here, it's not, where are we now? Where there's two, actually what it is, it's somewhere in the middle, one of the green blobs, but because you can't put all your labels on if you have too many, you know, whatever. So it's somewhere in the middle there, which means they haven't changed a lot, they have changed a bit. There has been some limits on free speech under the Conservative government, and the role of the state has been to look at the curriculum which is being taught on certain issues. So again, the UK Education Department has stepped in on a number of issues that you can argue, plus the fact that they have no private universities. They only have, essentially, there's only one. So they have essentially public universities, so the state can again intervene much more directly on state funding and things like that. Please.
I'm shocked to see, I worked in Sri Lanka for 25 years.
Yeah.
And my experience was that there was a considerable government influence and control of the academic world in Sri Lanka. I'm just shocked to see that the United States on net change is where it is in this scheme, in this map.
Right.
I guess I'm naive to not think, to be surprised by this.
I think that we always have we always imagine that education opportunities are so rich in America, and universities which lead the world, if you look at Nobel Prizes and you look at a variety of other scientific achievements. And yet it does appear that the limits are strong. Now, again, we can disaggregate this. We can pull it apart by all the different dimensions. There's 20 or so different dimensions go into the Academic Freedom Index. So we can look at all of those different aspects and see where or not America is going up or down, and provide a much better check card over time. In fact, it really suggests that I should do that by having a matrix design where I put up the issues where in academic life maybe there have been some advances and some which have gone backwards. And that would give us a better handle. But I actually describe in my paper as a case study what was going on in the United States. And of course, it is in many state houses, things like what can go into the library, what books are being banned by a small group, Mums for Liberty, who got organized and stopped all sorts of issues about LGBTQ, about quote unquote critical race theory, which is a bit of a myth, I think we can agree, as much as anything else, and a variety of other things. There's been a lot of incursions at state level in Republican controlled states. So even though this was the end of the period was the Biden administration, I think that what was happening in education well preceded the current Trump administration and was encouraged by the Trump administration. But let's look. So that's salutary. That says, you know, this is not just an academic thing. We really have to look at this harder. What about the second question of internal constraints? Do I have any evidence? So I do. Cancel culture is how we might often think about this in the popular discussion. And cancel culture is about a chilly climate, silencing speech deemed as derogatory, hostile, factually incorrect, or morally offensive. I wrote this as a paper a couple of years ago, and it's been widely cited as one of the ways to think about cancel culture. So what's the problem? It's essentially that there's often a predominant view within any group. And that view is one which says some things are within the boundary of discussion and some things are outside of it. Some things are things that we can argue about and talk about openly and disagree, but disagree and still kind of have a handshake. And some things are things which we don't ever talk about. You don't talk about, for example, flat earth physics if you're a physicist. You don't talk about certain theories and conspiracy theories which are so prevalent on other sorts of issues. But also, the argument, and this is an argument made by social conservatives, is that there's a predominant liberal culture on college campuses, that it's got worse over time. And what that means is that conservative perspectives, emphasizing traditional religious beliefs, or beliefs about race or ethnicity, or beliefs about women and men, or beliefs about transsexuality, all of these are things which are off the table in a university discussion, including, of course, issues about Israel and about the current situation going on in Gaza. And this sort of intolerance, it's argued, threatens viewpoint diversity, whether it's in publications or in speech or in the classroom. And it can be as a result of censorship by the state, or it can be group pressures. The people who are going to appoint you, the people who are going to hire you, the people who are going to promote you, the students who feel that they've got to get on with their colleagues in order to have a good social network, and otherwise they're going to be excluded from those networks. So if people self-censor, they're not going to speak up. They won't agree with the common view, but they're not going to talk about it. So how on earth do we get any evidence for this? So I'm glad you asked. There's a lot of popular stuff which is going on, popular media and also in politics and also in academic life and so on. What we can do is we can draw on a theory which came about in the 1970s from a German communication scholar, Elizabeth Noel Newman. And what she said was that we have a spiral of silence. And in any community, you have a predominant culture, certain norms, certain values, and others which are the heterodox. They don't agree. They just disagree, and they are a minority viewpoint. And the more that you're a majority, then the more you feel comfortable, and your voices can get louder because you know there's no social penalty if you speak. You'll get basically an endorsement, right? You'll get friends and promotions and networks and all those other good social cues that we want. If you're a minority and the proportion goes down and down and down, then eventually you just silence yourself. You won't speak up. And so this spiral of silence basically means that the fish out of water won't really be heard, and we don't even understand that they're in the same room, which I think is a really important observation. So when liberals say, of course, there's free speech, maybe, maybe not. What's the evidence? So I carried out a survey, and it's a survey of political science. You don't need to have the whole thing, except to say there are 2,000 people responded from 100 countries, and they're all in political science. This is the people who responded, and you can see from all the way from China through to Canada, through to Brazil, through to Russia. I had some responses. So this is how I started to measure self-censorship. And what we asked them in the questionnaire was, how often do you feel hesitant? And you can ask yourself this, to express controversial views and heterodox views in your teaching. Do you stand up for Israel and Netanyahu and the policy in a classroom? Do you give them equal weighting to those who would perhaps talk about Palestinian rights? Do you give equal weighting to those who say that there should be a traditional form of marriage versus those who say, no, there should be marriage between those who are of whatever sexuality and gender identity? Do you listen to both sides and give them both equal, and do you speak up in your teaching, your research, in your department, and in social media and in other public venues? So that's my measure of self-censorship. And then we measure a few other things. Do you think you're a minority in your department, in your views, in society. And then we measure people's left-right economic values. You don't need to worry about all of this, and their social values. Are you liberal? Are you conservative? And so on. Let's just look at the results briefly. First, is there a liberal bias in academia? And we can go right back to the earliest surveys done in the 1950s in America and in Britain. And we can look at it up to date. This is from 2023, the last time I carried out this. These are the Western societies, and those are, it's a scale from a 10-point scale from the most liberal social values to the most conservative. And it's on things like personal freedoms, abortion rights, same-sex, etc. What do you see? In Western countries, there's an enormous skew. Absolutely. I mean, there are hardly any conservatives over here in the academics which I surveyed across a wide range of different cultures, regions, countries, all in political science. So socially liberal views are indeed predominant across our Western part, but not in the non-Western developing countries. So when conservatives say who gets to speak and who gets to listen, who gets to talk, it is certainly liberals, and that's been found in many other surveys as well. On economic values, there's a similar bias. It's not so bad, but again, if we look at the Western countries, we can see tend to be slightly more left-wing on the economy, but it's the social values which are the predominant area where there's an enormous skew in the campus culture. And what does this mean for how people speak up? What does this mean for how people self-censor? So you remember that self-censorship measure I told you about, which was the one which is whether or not you speak up in a variety of different contexts, you hesitate to express controversial views in 5 different contexts. And this is the liberals, and they're fine. That's the self-censorship index going up. Moderates, a bit more. Conservatives, absolutely. Conservatives don't feel comfortable speaking on all of these very different, different issues. They are going to silence themselves in a liberal culture. In non-Western countries, not so much, which again is an interesting question about why that is. These are more traditional cultures, but in the West, absolutely. And not only that, this breaks it down a little further, and it says the same thing. When do people self-censor under different contexts? And you can see in their teaching, their research, their department or institution, social media and other public venues, again, conservatives are silencing themselves. They're not speaking up. Liberals are feeling pretty comfortable on most of these different contexts, particularly in their department, where it's really important for a scholar, if you're going to get promoted, if you're going to get tenure, if you're going to get any sort of opportunities in your career, you need to get on with your colleagues, and liberals are fine. And I have to say, by the way, of course, I am a liberal. I'm a self-confessed liberal. That is my bias. But what this suggests is that the conservatives who are in academia, which is a small minority, are not comfortable. They're not speaking up. There is indeed a problem in academia. This explains some of it. I won't go into it in detail because I know that none of you really want to look at the detail at all, but nevertheless, what I've done is simply, this is whether or not you are self-censoring. That's your dependent variable. And the most significant thing here is clearly, if you're a liberal or conservative on your social values, the more conservative you are, the more you'll self-censor. In your department, the more you'll self-censor. If you favor robust speech, the less you'll self-censor. That's a set of values. If you believe that the system has worsened, cancel culture has worsened, you're more likely to censor yourself. There's a little bit on these other factors, but even when I control for that, it doesn't make a lot of difference. And the more that your country has worse academic freedom, that also has an impact on self-censorship. So self-censorship is a problem. It's not just something you can dismiss. It's not just something because Trump is saying something and the conservatives are saying something that we have to say that's not the case. I think there is a problem. And it's really the reason why when we talk about academic freedom, we're both on different sides of this debate. What do we mean by it? Liberals often mean state intervention, and conservatives often mean the campus culture, which has got a skew in a set of values, which is really problematic. So just to skip ahead, what we've said is that's the argument. And what we have to talk about ourselves is what do we do about these things? And by the way, I'm not alone in this. Alan Garber, in his own words, has said, yes, we have to have viewpoint diversity on campus. When we're talking about sensitive issues, we can't only listen to one side. We can't only talk to one side. We can't present politically biased or ideologically biased or skewed views to our colleagues or to each other if we're students. But how do you get that viewpoint diversity? Especially on those hot button issues which are so difficult for America to come together on. How on earth do you get viewpoint diversity in a classroom, for example, on issues of Israel and Gaza? I don't know. So we're struggling with those things, but that's the conclusion. Academic freedoms are really important and valued. The threats are growing, especially in autocracies. The Freedom Index shows a decline, is linked to a broader phenomena of democratic backsliding. The internal events are serious. The internal threats are also serious and need to be recognized and demonstrated. But the key question, I don't know, what do we do to really change these things? So I'm going to finish by saying that we've done two things which we're going to talk about over lunch, and then we'll have the Q&A. One is this draft motion, which is up for grabs. It's a draft which has got some ideas, but we as a community, as an association, may wish to amend this, but also then potentially endorse this and pass this on to not simply, I think, Alan Garber, and not simply people within Harvard who frankly will agree. I mean, they're never going to dispute it, right? But to say, can I send it on to somebody else, another NGO? Can I send it on to my member of Congress? Can I send it on to local representatives? Particularly, of course, if any of you live in Republican districts, which is not always that common necessarily. But we need to get to every side on these sorts of debates. And you can look at that over lunch and go through what it says and see whether or not you do or do not want to endorse that. And then lastly, we've got this working lunch, and I'm going to give you all three questions because, of course, at Harvard, you always have homework after a class. And what the three questions are: what can the president do to counter external constraints? You know they're having the lawsuit. You know they're trying to raise money. What else can they do? And if you can think of really effective ways and strategies, that would be important. What should the president and corporation do to counter internal constraints? In other words, this viewpoint diversity issue, which is really difficult to do. And then how can we, as members of the HCCC and other alumni associations, play an active role in supporting Harvard in this process? And the idea is that everybody has a leader and a rapporteur at a table, and you come up with 2 or 3 ideas, and that you'll report back, and then the board will take it further forward. Right, Denise? That's what we're planning to do. So that's the presentation. Let's talk about whether or not you agree and disagree with any of the comments and thoughts and where we are with all of these things. And I think we've got a little time for Q&A and to talk about any of these sorts of issues. Please, yes, Roger.
Mind-opening and especially the second, third layer down.
Yes.
Debate discussions. My question is,
It should be the way. If you can make conservatives feel more comfortable in their discussions, both students and faculty and people who can really talk to each other and deliberate, we're having things at the Kennedy School which are talking about constructive disagreement and how we can get to that rather than storming out of a classroom or protesting on campus, but we can really talk about these issues one-to-one or as a group and try to work out why it is that we differ. Then that can help the overall climate. And it has to be said, we also have to think about hiring and recruitment of faculty and of staff and of other, in other words, we are what the composition of our college is. And so if we, for example, if we bring in more who have had military service, we might well have a slightly more conservative, or if we bring in more who do religious work, other than not just at the Divinity School, but say within the Kennedy School, or if we think about other ways in which we can try to encourage certain groups who might have differing views to our own, perhaps think about the strategy of where we recruit from across America. Do we really recruit very heavily from New England, which tends to be more liberal, or do we try to recruit from the South and from other areas in the areas in the Midwest, which are perhaps more conservative in their social leanings? And it's not simply recruiting them, but once they're in the Harvard community, how do we respect those views when we disagree with those views? And that, for me, is difficult, even in my own teaching, as I try to do this. So there is no simple solution for all of this. And it might be, by the way, that this takes such a long time to do that it won't affect any of the current legal troubles or the state initiatives to try to step in to control this. But if you understand this whole idea of why the campus is so liberal and what the problems are of self-censorship, it really gives you an insight about why the Conservatives in the Trump administration have started to use the role of the law to encourage this sort of thing. They think that Harvard can't do it in itself, or scholars won't do it in itself. They need to be forced or pressured to do it. I'm not sure that they do need to be pressured, but that's certainly a large part of the motivation behind the talk about why there's a moral right for the state to intervene on these sorts of issues. Yeah? Yes, please. Yes, Roger. Why don't you ask the question? Any of the questions you can see.
Okay. Good.
So the issues that you raise and the skewedness that you raise, to what degree has Harvard and other universities been addressing these over time, or is it all of a sudden they become issues for discussion, and so Harvard is writing letters and reacting?
Right. So why is it now that we're suddenly having this? And I think it's the polarization in the parties, and the polarization in America has changed. So if we go back to the earlier studies, which were done in the 1950s of academics, they did surveys then of all the different disciplines, and disciplines change, by the way, they differ. But nevertheless, they found a liberal skew in the 50s. They found a liberal skew in the 1970s. They found a liberal skew in Britain, as well as in America, and as well as in some European countries. So there's nothing new about academics being more liberal and progressive. After all, we know that's where, for example, the 1960s hot and button politics kind of came from, students and workers and so on the street. But what's changed is that as the Republican Party has moved further to the right, as I demonstrated in my previous talk, so they've been more offended by the sources who they feel are underrepresenting their viewpoint. Everything's become more ideological. The parties have become more purist. And so they feel that liberals have increased on campus a bit, but I think it's also the parties themselves have polarized, right?
Being addressed by, is this a theme that's newly being addressed by the university, or has the university been addressing it over a long period?
I think that the university nobody's been that much aware of this. So the current shock to the system, which we saw from the first letter of the 11th of April, has really focused the mind. We always knew from the campus protests that there was going to be problems because how different universities have dealt with that has been difficult. But obviously there are claims on both sides of both anti-Muslim sentiment and anti-Semitism. And so that kind of brought that single issue to the forefront. But I think there's been a long-term imbalance in liberalism, which, because the Republicans have moved further to the right, they're more hostile towards. And because Trump has been willing to break all the rules on everything else, of course, he's willing to stop this, along with critics in the press, along with critics who are NGOs and other non-profits, along with critics who are international. I mean, there's a whole bunch of things which he's been attacking, which other presidents haven't attacked. But all of you will know from your own experience, you've been to Harvard. When you were at Harvard years ago, was there a liberal bias? Yes. Why? Because liberalism goes with education. The two things are hand in hand. Every single study I've ever looked at in political sociology says that the more educated you are, you tend to be more liberal. You know more about the world, and that knowledge gives you more confidence, and that confidence gives you more liberal values. And the younger are kind of at the forefront of that, right? Has it got worse? Possibly. Certainly, if I think, for example, in the government department, which I'm very familiar with, we have one conservative, basically, and not many others who speak out with that perspective, whereas in the 60s and 70s, maybe there were a couple more conservatives. But it's the fact that the Conservatives have become more radical and the liberal bastions have remained strong, which has created this conflict, along with lots of other factors like Black Lives Matter and a whole bunch of other things which politicize the left. And obviously the Democrats moved somewhat to the left and liberals have moved somewhat towards the progressive wing, and then the Conservatives have moved even further on the right. So these issues are more salient, plus the fact it's the anti-woke agenda which, you know, motivates so much of the Trump administration. And we're at the forefront of the anti-woke. Please. Oh.
So I'm the Harvard Radcliffe class of 69, which was the one that took over University Hall. And every single week we have a Zoom of classmates. And our Republican voting classmates join the Zoom. And we have some great debates. And I think that what Harvard was trying to do when I was at college was by not having, you know, final clubs were really a no thing then. And they wanted to force us to be together all the time. So we ran into people. Whereas now it's the polarization. Your roommate isn't a conservative. So you don't hear that all the time. And, you know, my brother went to Princeton. We argued out policy every single night, making everyone uncomfortable. But you can love somebody and still disagree with them. And that's what people seem to have lost. But our class is still keeping it alive.
How we do that more generally. And I mean, obviously on campus, you've got a very privileged, but also a very close community. And you'd have thought that people could talk to each other, and the dorms haven't changed that much. And the environment has got social media, but nevertheless, it's still got that mix in the classroom. But people just are intolerant. And as we know, America's intolerant. I mean, it's nothing new. So of course the young would be as intolerant as everybody else.
They say people rather somebody marry a Catholic than a Republican now.
As an experimental tiny step, would there be a place for a team teaching experiment with a liberal and conservative sharing the podium? I think that might be a way to start, at least on a small scale.
That does assume that we have enough conservatives who are willing to stand up, but if they're self-censoring as faculty, you know, think about a Sam Huntington. He was very conservative in his foreign policy views, and Brzezinski and so on. There have been in the past a whole tradition of fairly hawkish Republicans who were part of the Kennedys, part of the government department. But if there aren't enough of them now, we might have gone past a critical mass. The other thing is that we have gone towards things like institutional neutrality. In other words, the president does not come out every day and say, well, we're against this and we're against that on behalf of the institution, unless it actually affects the institution. So we don't have policies on 101 things that we might have otherwise made a declaration on, climate change or abortion rights or women's rights or race or anything like that. We try to restrict all of those statements. And again, in the classroom, a lot of my science colleagues are saying people should just be much more neutral. They should not be advocates. They should be analysts, which is true. On the other hand, at the Kennedy School, we teach advocacy. We want people to get involved in politics. We want people to get engaged. We don't want them to sit down and just talk about the problems like an endless seminar. So I think it does depend on your discipline and your department and your students as to about what role you're going to have. But getting people together on a collective basis to teach, if you could, but also doesn't that assume that I'm either a liberal or a conservative? In other words, we're falling into the same trap. And on some issues, I might be liberal, and others I might be conservative. So I don't want to stereotype people and saying, you speak for the conservatives, and you speak for the liberals, and you speak for the Greens, and you speak for X, Y, and Z, because that could be a problem as well. Now, by the way, I also have debates where I do ask people to, like a lawyer, defend the view that they don't agree with. And I think that's a great discipline if you can do that. But they always fail. They stop playing their role after a bit. They go back to their passions, right? Please.
Thanks very much, Pippa. Going back to your chart where you compared democracy and you tracked democracy against academic freedom, there was something that some of those top democratic countries had. Going back. One more. Okay, so it seems like I did a quick look at Germany, France, Chile, Italy, Brazil, and they have not only democracy, but it seems like they also have written into their constitution the notion of academic freedom. And America doesn't. Right, so we're not doing so well. The closest we can get to it is freedom of speech. And then everything has to be litigated from then and won by court case by court case. So that seems like a significant, maybe we should be agitating for an amendment to the Constitution to put academic freedom right in like those other top countries.
However, a can of worms, as we know, because if the Liberals start doing that, then the Conservatives are going to do all sorts of things. And as Trump says, does the president have to obey the Constitution? Well, let's look at our beautiful lawyers, or whatever his words were. We don't. But I do think there are some things we can learn from the countries which are strong. But it is also interesting, they're quite varied. Like Germany has a hate speech law, which in America would be seen as antithetical, where you can't speak about certain things because of their past history, etc. But there are different traditions in different countries, but they're all up there with strong democracy, strong universities, strong academic freedoms, and high levels of affluence and various other things as well. I mean, please.
So we have a question. This is a question from virtual regarding the letter that was sent to Harvard. Have we seen such demands in other countries?
Well, it does depend which country we're talking about. The idea that the state should intervene in some ways is different, particularly if you have a public sector. So if most of your universities are dominated, I'm sorry, I'm going the wrong way, aren't I? I was going back to that letter. But if most of your universities are dominated by the state, then of course the state can play a much more direct role in all sorts of issues. Back. Oh, it's right at the very beginning. This thing here. No, that one there. So some of these things in different countries can be accepted and some of them cannot. You can think about things like, obviously, issues of affirmative action. And you get, in a number of countries, the use of quotas are by law, and they're often in the constitution as well. And so that is something which is accepted. In other countries, that's seen as impermissible. But you don't see, in most democracies, even electoral democracies, viewpoint diversity audited in admissions and hiring. In other words, the state says, yes, we'll give you a certain amount of money, and certainly we'll give students grants and various other opportunities, but they don't directly involve themselves in a profession which is seen as self-governance, with certain standards which, through peer review and through training and accreditation, are what basically gives somebody a job. The department is autonomous in that regard. Please.
In meeting with our representative recently, one of the things that Bill Keating said is we have to start calling a lie a lie. And it seems that part of the confusion, whether you're talking about measles or now we're going to start looking at the medical journals and censoring them, or first it was the big lie about the election, but so many of now I think one of the big lies that we're looking at Harvard and everywhere else is that opposing the war in Gaza is anti-Semitism. And people are starting to talk about that. But I'm with Keating on that. We have to start talking more about, well, that's not true. That's a lie, because we're being inundated with lies. And there's so many, it's really hard to deal with them. And I'm not really sure to go with all of that, except that when you get so much of that, and we talk about misinformation, and he says we have to start talking about lies.
About that a bit more in terms of if you were a Jewish student and you were being jostled in a protest and people in your dorm weren't speaking to you. In other words, I think many Jewish students felt that in those protest periods that they were facing a hostile climate, and there was clearly a predominance of those who were supporting the Palestinian side and the Gaza side. So that's the whole point about the self-censorship bit. It might be that it wasn't explicit anti-Semitism, but they still felt it was. And if they feel it was, then it's rather like sexual harassment. If the woman says it's sexual harassment, even if the man says, no, it wasn't, it was just, you know, nice friendship, then you have to believe the woman. If the Jewish population feels that somehow there was anti-Semitism, then you have to believe them, even if objectively it wasn't intended or it wasn't explicitly anti-Semitic in the way that it was framed. So it's an incredibly complex issue is what I'm trying to say. But how do we know whether there was or was not? And of course, we have had our committee, which has looked at both anti-Muslim bias and has looked at anti-Semitic, and they've come up with a series of recommendations, highly controversial, of course, on campus. But nevertheless, you might want to look at those and see what's being done. But they are addressing those issues. Alan Garber says, yes, I'm Jewish and I believe there really was anti-Semitism. It isn't just a lie. And again, it's easy for liberals to say it's a lie because we're often feeling that we're morally tolerant. We listen to other views. We want to hear other views. We welcome other views. And yet, do we? I think there's a self-reflection that we need to look at ourselves to say, how much do I tolerate? A simple example, I teach classes on democracy. I've taught them for 30 years. When I have students who say, oh, well, I'm from China and I really think China's got a better system than America or Sweden or France or whatever, then there's a limit to how far I can accommodate that. There's a limit to how far I can accept or empathize with that, let's put it that way. I can hear it and I can encourage that view if they want to express that view, and I try not to suppress it. But I tell you this, if you don't believe in democracy in my classes, are you really going to come up and say it that often? And probably you won't.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, I'd love to stay longer without Harvard, but I just appreciate your presentation. Thank you. Got a doctor's appointment. I gotta get there. Otherwise, I would stay and maybe even do some work.
Thank you for coming.
Very much.
And I don't for a minute want to deny that all these students who, and I just listened to them talk the other day online, and we're talking about anti-Semitism, and, which is real, and as Islamophobia, but conflating the two of them as automatic, that a student now, if they say I'm opposed to the war in Gaza, is then accused of something that they don't see as the same thing. And it makes it harder for them to speak up as well. So you've now got this third group who isn't, well, I can't speak up either because I will then be accused of something that isn't really what I'm about.
And there are many Jewish groups. There's one in the New York Times today who say that the criticism of anti-Semitism has been overblown and it's been used as an excuse in order to criticize these institutions. And I totally buy that from my own personal experience, but I'm not Jewish, and therefore maybe there are elements which, again, I'm dismissing or which I don't understand from my own values and perspectives and so on.
Comes to mind is, as everyone was talking, what comes to mind to me was a quote from Stephen Covey. Maybe we should be seeking to understand first when we have conversations with other people.
Understanding your questions about something, understanding when you're wanting to protest about something, even understanding, as we know, for example, Donald Trump is really a challenge. And to understand MAGA and to understand those 40% of the public who says, yes, he's a great president, he's breaking everything, isn't that wonderful? But if you don't understand that, of course, you can't counter it. And we fall back on the things we think can work, economic development, reductions in poverty, only to find that they don't work, they fall flat on their faces. And I think that's fundamentally one of the problems of the Democratic Party. They're trying to listen, but they're not very good at it in lots of different ways, right? Any other questions in our chat line? Oh, okay, good. Well, we might have time for our lunch then. What time are we? Yeah, we are.
Thank you.
You're welcome.